Mr. Lawrence Wong.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I thank the members of the House who have shared their views on the bill and who have supported it. Members' comments and queries can be categorized into a bucket of different issues, and I will address them in turn. First, on MAS's management of the OFR. Mr. Liang Eng Hua, Mr. Louis Ng, Mr. Saktian Di Supa, Mr. Don, we have all asked questions about how the optimal amount of OFR is determined and how MAS reviews this. MAS regularly reviews and updates the optimal amount of OFR for its needs. In its reviews, MAS uses a range of internationally used reserves adequacy measures within a general cost-benefit framework to assess the required amount of OFR. From a benefits perspective, the OFR provides MAS with the means to protect the functioning and stability of the economy against shocks. So MAS takes reference from historical episodes of such significant domestic and international disruptions to compute the OFR that is necessary to safeguard stability and confidence. From the cost perspective, MAS recognizes the opportunity cost of holding reserves in liquid financial instruments on its balance sheet in terms of the higher returns foregone if these assets had not been invested in longer-term assets by GIC. As Singapore's economic and financial linkages with global markets continue to expand and deepen, the OFR required should broadly keep in line with GDP and complements the structural factors underpinning Singapore's macroeconomic and financial soundness. Based on these considerations, MAS has therefore assessed that the OFR of 65 to 75% of GDP is adequate to meet its needs, and OFR above this amount would then be transferred to the government to be managed separately. As we have repeatedly said, this is not a new idea. The point about transferring excess OFR to GIC for long-term management is not new at all. It's the very reason why GIC was set up in 1981. So when Mr. Leong talked about a departure from the principles that Dr. Goh had set up, there is no departure. This is completely in line and consistent with the founding principles upon which we do reserves management. There is also the question on the framework under which MAS manages the OFR. MAS manages the OFR with the primary objectives of maintaining confidence in Singapore's exchange rate-based monetary policy framework and securing macroeconomic and financial stability. The key elements underpinning this OFR management framework are robust risk management, including an appropriate liquidity profile and a well-diversified asset allocation across geographies, asset classes, and currencies. These elements serve to produce a resilient portfolio and safeguard the OFR's availability to support MAS's conduct of monetary policy. Subject to these elements, MAS seeks to achieve good long-term returns on its OFR, and that would include taking steps to manage longer-term risks, like the impact of climate change, and in that regard, MAS will look at a range of instruments, including green instruments, which Mr. Don had mentioned. Both the risk management approach and asset allocation are approved by the MAS board and reviewed regularly. Mr. Donwy also asked if the MAS values the OFR at cost or market price. The MAS publishes OFR data on a monthly basis, and the published OFR is valued at cost. And this reflects our conservative accounting approach as a central bank. Next set of questions pertain to risk that RMGS may pose to MAS's operations and balance sheet. Mr. Derek Goh asked how MAS's autonomy can be ensured when subscribing for RMGS. Let me state very clearly, MAS has always been operating independently within the government. MAS's principal objective of maintaining price stability is stipulated in the MAS Act, and under the law, the MAS's Board of Directors is responsible for the policy and general administration of MAS's affairs and business, and in upholding the MAS Act, ensures that MAS conducts monetary policy to meet its price stability mandate. And with the introduction of RMGS, MAS continues to retain autonomy over monetary policy. because it is MAS, not the government, that initiates the subscription of RMGS. Furthermore, MAS can only subscribe for RMGS to facilitate the transfer of OFR beyond what it requires to conduct monetary policy and ensure financial stability. And MAS will also have the right to redeem RMGS before maturity at par to meet its OFR needs and carry out its mandate. So these safeguards are all set out very clearly in the Act. Mr. Saktiandi asked about foreign exchange risk. RMGS transactions are between entities within the government. At the whole of government level, there is no change in our total foreign reserves and no additional exposure to foreign exchange risk. For MAS, its subscription for RMGS will result in a change in assets from OFR denominated in foreign currency to RMGS denominated in Sing dollar. This reduces the exchange rate risk for MAS by lowering its foreign exchange exposure. Correspondingly, the exposure to currency fluctuations, along with the returns on investments, are in turn borne by the government, inherently as part of its larger portfolio of investments placed with GIC. Mr. Saktiandi also asked if the accumulation of RMGS on MAS's balance sheet over time will affect the level of liquidity in the banking system and consequently MAS's monetary operations. Basically, MAS's accumulation of RMGS on its balance sheet will not impact Sing dollar liquidity and by extension MAS's sterilization activities. This is because MAS uses only foreign assets to subscribe for RMGS and does not create or use Sing dollar in the process. On the frequency of published data, MAS will publish its RMGS holdings on a monthly basis. This is aligned with the frequency for the publication of OFR data, which is in line with international standards. And I would like to assure Mr. Saktiandi that the publication of RMGS data does not undermine the effectiveness of MAS's foreign exchange intervention operations. Changes in the OFR are influenced by other factors besides intervention operations and transfers to the government. These include changes in the stock of foreign exchange swaps as part of MAS's money market operations to manage liquidity in the banking system, investment gains or losses on the OFR, and currency translation effects on the OFR. In addition, data on Singapore's foreign exchange intervention operations is already separately disclosed. MAS publishes its net purchases of foreign exchange from intervention operations on a 6-month aggregated basis with a 3-month lag from the end of the period. So these addresses questions relating to risks to the MAS. I think there are a third set of questions on the characteristics of RMGS, such as its maturity and early redemption features. Mr. Louis Ng and Associate Professor James Lim queried about the basis and purpose of the $580 billion issuance limit. In fact, they thought that there might not be a need for such a limit. On the other hand, Mr. Leong Man Wai suggested to tighten and have an annual limit. As I explained in my earlier speech, the $580 billion limit is sized based on 2 factors. One, the amount of OFR that MAS currently needs to transfer to the government to bring the level of OFR in MAS back to its optimal amount. And 2, the expected pace of OFR accumulation in future years. We have set this limit so that the government can administer and monitor the size of the RMGS issuance. And having such a limit will provide transparency to Parliament, which serves as an additional layer of check. Yes, indeed, we could have done away with it completely, but we thought that it would be prudent and would provide an additional layer of check for the government to come back to Parliament to raise the limit should the need arise. And any such further increase to this limit will have to be justified by the government and approved by Parliament and President. Mr. Saktiandi also asked about the maturity period for RMGS issuances. The purpose of issuing RMGS is to facilitate the transfer of OFR for longer-term investment, and such all RMGS will be issued by the government with a 20-year tenure, which is aligned with GIC's long-term investment horizon. Mr. Saktiandi noted that there may be periods where the OFR falls below the optimal range and may need to be topped up. And he asked how RMGS could be liquidated to meet MAS's needs and whether there may be circumstances under which MAS might transfer its RMGS holdings to other entities with the consent of the Minister for Finance. answer to this is that the optimal amount of OFR, which is, as I said, sized at 65% to 75% of GDP, is not an insignificant amount and is expected to meet MES's needs comfortably under most circumstances. To date, there has not been a crisis where MES's OFR has fallen below this threshold. So MES's OFR will only need to be topped up in a highly unlikely crisis of unprecedented scale, or what we call a tail risk event. Should such a situation arise, MES will have the right to redeem the RMGS before maturity at par, meaning at full face value of the RMGS regardless of market conditions to meet its OFR needs. When MES redeems the RMGS, the government will transfer an equivalent amount of foreign assets to MES, supplementing the OFR on MES's balance sheet. And with the government standing fully behind all the RMGS, we do not envisage that MES will need to transfer its RMGS holdings to other entities to raise funds from the market. And that is why Clause 15B2A of the bill, which Mr. Sakyandi referred to, prohibits MES transfers of RMGS holdings to other entities without consent from the Minister for Finance. This upholds the intent of the RMGS by restricting MES's transfers of RMGS holdings to other entities to very exceptional and extreme situations as determined by the Minister. To be clear, even if such a transfer were to take place, the effectiveness of the proposed legislative safeguards, including those to prevent monetary financing, would not be diminished, irrespective of the entities owning the RMGS. I think there was also a question whether a future government can introduce conditions to compromise MES's ability to redeem RMGS, and why the bill does not provide for MES with the sole discretion on redeeming the RMGS prematurely, and why allow the government to do so. I think Mr. Lewis Ng asked this. The government will not be able to compromise MES's ability to redeem RMGS. As I explained earlier, the terms for issuance of RMGS, including its conditions as to repayment and redemption, will need to be mutually agreed between MES and the government. Operationally, MES and the government will set the conditions to give MES the right to redeem RMGS at par before maturity, meaning it can exercise this right at its discretion. The government may choose to redeem RMGS before maturity if it has access as Sing dollar liquidity. Allowing the government to do so does not compromise the MES. MES will not be worse off because the amount of OFR held remains unchanged. Several members asked how RMGS will affect GIC's investment and liquidity management, including the implications if RMGS is redeemed before maturity at par to meet MES's OFR needs, and how the foreign reserves managed by GIC could be made available to MES in such a scenario. I would like to assure members that the introduction of RMGS and its early redemption provision will have minimal impact on how GIC invests and manages its liquidity. The introduction of RMGS facilitates the transfer of OFR not needed by the MES to the government for longer-term investment by GIC. And as I said, the mechanism may be new, but the transfers of such OFR is not new. In short, GIC will invest the transferred OFR. How GIC will invest the transferred OFR is not expected to deviate from existing practice, because such transfers have been happening since the formation of GIC. GIC manages the transferred OFR and other government assets in accordance with its mandate given by the government. And as a long-term investor, GIC will look at long-term opportunities, including sustainability opportunities and green investment opportunities, which several members talked about. The existing arrangement between MES and the government already ensures that foreign reserves held by the government are available to support MES's operations if the need arises. And the government has in place processes to withdraw assets from GIC for various needs. Therefore, liquidity needs pertaining to RMGS are already catered for. Even in the unlikely case where the redemption exceeds what had been catered for, the government can still repay MES with assets which qualify as OFR. So there is no need for GIC to liquidate assets prematurely just to raise cash to repay MES in the event of early redemption. Next, there was a question by an associate professor on whether or not MES deliberately keeps the exchange rate low in order for competitiveness reasons. Let me state quite categorically, MES does not do that. MES's aim is price stability over the medium term. We are quite clear that keeping the Sing dollar artificially weak is unsustainable and not in Singapore's interest. The real exchange rate, not the nominal, but the real exchange rate is the outcome of price adjustments in the economy, in Singapore's economy, relative to that in other partner economies. And so long as monetary policy here is set preemptively with the objective of medium-term price stability, then the real exchange rate will, in time, be in line and appropriate to economic fundamentals. And we fully intend for that to be the case. Also, Mr. Leong Man Wai, I think, besides some of the points which I had addressed, set out quite a number of points which I found quite puzzling. It's almost as though he had not read the full text of the speech or of the bill or listened to what I had said earlier, because I had set out very clearly in my opening speech that there are all these various safeguards and provisions which ensure that there is no room for monetary financing with this new RMGS mechanism. This is not a major departure at all. This is simply a new mechanism to facilitate the transfer of excess OFR from MAS to the government for long-term investments by GIC. Such transfers have been happening since 1981 when GIC was formed and continues till today, except with a new mechanism called the RMGS. I thank Professor Hoon for explaining this very clearly, and I would urge Mr. Leong to listen to Professor Hoon's explanations of why our OFR had increased in recent years due to MES's intervention operations to dampen appreciation pressures on the Sing dollar, and why this is not at all monetary financing in the way he had imagined. We do not intend to do any form of monetary financing, and there are safeguards in the bill to ensure this does not take place. So the hypothetical scenarios that Mr. Leong had set out in his speech about hyperinflation, monetary financing, these will not arise. Finally, let me talk about what all this means also for fiscal policy, because there were various questions about this, including what Mr. Liang asked on whether the returns from the transferred OFR would contribute to NIRC, net investment returns contribution. The transfers of OFR not needed by MES to the government, as enabled by RMGS, should have a slight positive impact on the NIRC over the long term. This is to be expected because GIC has a higher return-seeking portfolio than MES. Having said that, this increase is not expected to be significant, at least in the short term. And under the Net Investment Returns Framework, or NIR framework, changes in the net asset base are smoothed over time, and any longer-term returns would also take time to materialize. Our medium to long-term fiscal projections have already built in this practice of continuous transfers to get back to the optimal range and have accounted for the higher expected return from OFR being invested by GIC. That said, it is also possible that we will face a structurally lower rate of return on our investments over the long term. This is due to the significant headwinds in the external environment, including elevated debt, moderation in growth, aging populations, and low productivity in many countries. We have explained this in this House on several occasions, and it is consistent with reports by well-managed long-term global funds. Furthermore, investments come with risk, and there will be volatility from time to time. There is no guarantee that NIRC will always be increasing every year. At the same time, on the spending side, on the expenditure side, we do expect expenditures to go up. Just as a comparison, from 2006 to 2010, our spending was about 15% of GDP. 2006 to 2010. A decade later, from 2016 to 2020, we are looking at 18% of GDP. 3% of GDP increase, which is about $15 billion. And we do expect that to increase further in the coming years. So we will have to continue to rely on both NIRC and other revenue measures to meet our growing fiscal needs. Having diverse sources of revenues will also give us the confidence to plan ahead for the long-term growth of Singapore, and I will elaborate on these issues in the coming budget. This is not the occasion to talk about fiscal projections. I just wanted to give an explanation in response to the questions that were raised. And on transparency, a point that Mr. Leong Man Wai mentioned, in fact, a lot of information has already been put out in the public domain about how we manage reserves, about the different entities that look after our reserves, Temasek, GIC, MAS, their investment approaches. A lot of information is out there for serious analysts to understand how reserve management is done in Singapore. And we will review and continue to see how we can put out more useful information to inform the public. But we do maintain the view that it is not in Singapore's interest to put out the full information on how much reserves we have. The reserves are ultimately a strategic asset against a whole range of emergency contingency scenarios. We can never predict what these scenarios will be. It's not just about an economic or financial crisis. It could be a natural calamity. It could be a pandemic, as we have experienced. It could be war. It could be actions taken by a hostile external actor. Whole range of contingency scenarios and emergencies for which we will not know how much resources we need to respond. So we believe that it is still in our national interest to maintain this strategic asset, not to have to disclose everything fully, but to have some discretion on our part and to be able to use these resources decisively and effectively when such an emergency arises. So in summary, sir, this bill creates a more sustainable mechanism to facilitate MAS's transfer of OFR above what it requires to the government for longer-term management by GIC. As I have repeatedly highlighted, safeguards will be put in place to circumscribe tightly the issuance and subscription of RMGS by the government and MAS respectively, so that RMGS is used only for its intended purpose. I would like to assure members of the House that with the introduction of RMGS, MAS will continue to have access to sufficient OFR to meet its needs, and that the government's approach to borrowing has not changed and will remain prudent and disciplined. With this, I beg to move, sir.
Clarifications? Mr. Leong Man Wai.
Thank you, Speaker. I have two questions for the Minister for Finance. One is, yes, we may not need to announce another number for for our national reserves, but will he agree that every year when the government financial statements are published, the mainstream media should report our country's statement of assets and liabilities, meaning the $1.4 trillion of financial assets, for example, will be announced in the public? That's one question. Second question is, can I ask, what is the average rate of reserve accumulations in the past, and what is the expected reserve accumulation going forward? Because when he described that this round we probably have to transfer $200 billion, use up the RMGS limit, about $200 billion to transfer the assets to GIC, we are still left with $380 billion. And he said that in a few years' time, we will be accumulating, I mean, that's what I hear from what he said. There will be a lot of reserves to accumulate, you know, another $380 billion. That's why I have suggested that we should reduce the limit. Okay, two questions. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, on the first question, MOF will put out all relevant information pertaining to the budget and to the government's financial position. I think it's for the media to decide what they want to report, and it's for analysts to also put out the, dive deeper into the statistics and to see if they want to produce analytical pieces around them. But where the government is concerned, we already put out a lot of information, as I mentioned, every year, during the budget, after the budget, and we will continue to review what additional information we might put out that would be useful. On the second point, we have set the limit, as I mentioned earlier, for the issuance of RMGS on 2 counts, looking at the amount that would have to be transferred over a period of time to get the present OFR to the optimal level, and also bearing in mind that there will be future accumulation in future years. No one can predict what rate this future accumulation will be. It will depend on so many uncertain conditions in the financial markets. So it can go either way, because you may have appreciating pressures, you may have depreciating pressures, and MES will have to intervene accordingly in order to maintain price stability. But we have put in our best estimates, and we think that 580 is a sensible figure for the next few years. And should that threshold be reached, then, as I mentioned, we will come back to Parliament to ask to explain why we might need more, why we might have to raise the limit, and it's for the government to justify the case and for Parliament and President to approve. And so this provides that additional check. In fact, as I mentioned just now, there were some calls from Associate Professor Lim and Mr. Louis Ng to say no limit is needed at all, because they understood the reasons why we are making this transfer. They know that it's sensible, and they also appreciate that there are already sufficient safeguards in legislation that would not allow MES or the government to engage in monetary financing. So from that point of view, you might not even need a limit, but we thought through this and felt that it would be prudent to do so, to provide an additional layer of check, and that's why we have that figure in the bill. Thank you.
Mr. Leong.
Speaker, I would still like to ask the Minister again. I'm actually puzzled when he said that there's no departure from the current way we are doing things. So currently, when we buy foreign assets, the MAS buy foreign assets from the market, the MAS uses government deposits. Okay, right? So if in the future we don't have government deposits, which I have explained in my speech, those are our excess savings. If in the future our excess savings come down drastically, and we don't have excess savings to buy the foreign reserves, and MAS will have to buy the foreign reserves with Singapore dollars, right? So that will be a very different way of managing our monetary policy going forward. So there's a major departure. So especially when he suggested a $580 billion limit, that means over the next few years, okay, let's say $380 billion left after the current transfer, and you use it over 5 years, for example, then you will be talking about 70 billion accumulation of reserves every year. That is a big amount. I think the current amount, currently, I do not know the number. Probably currently we are accumulating at about $30 to $50 billion a year, right? So you say that we don't have the excess savings anymore, and on top of that, you are accumulating 70 billion. That is a big amount.
Mr. Speaker, I think Mr. Leong is mistaken. The excess OFR that MAS accumulates, or the OFR that's accumulated by MAS, is primarily the result of MAS's intervention operations. When this happens, particularly to manage the appreciation pressures on the Sing dollar because of capital inflows, and when this happens, it accumulates foreign exchange. Under present circumstances without RMGS, MAS will transfer its excess OFR to the government, and there will be a corresponding reduction in government deposits. That's today's mechanism. The excess OFR is MAS's excess OFR, right? But because government has been accumulating the pace in which government deposits is accumulating is been quite slow because we are running smaller fiscal surpluses. There will not be able to do the corresponding reduction in government deposits, and that's why this new mechanism allows MES to use its excess OFR to subscribe to RMGS. In either case, it is MES initiating the action. It's not government initiating the action. It is MES that initiates this action, this transfer of excess OFR. And in both cases, it is the excess OFR that MES has accumulated through intervention operations that is transferred to the government. In the first case, through a deposit transfer. In the second case, through an RMGS instrument. But in both cases, it is a transfer of excess OFR to the government, which will then be put to GIC for investment management over the long term. That is why I say this process of transfer is not new. If you read the book that GIC recently published, you will see Dr. Goh referring to monetary reserves and non-monetary reserves. Non-monetary reserves are the excess OFR that we are talking about, which MES has, and then it transfers to the government. In the first instance, through a transfer of government deposits. In the second instance, through RMGS, which we are proposing. The mechanism may be new, but the transfer of excess OFR is not new at all. It's something that we have been doing since 1981, and in that sense, is not a departure from our underlying philosophy and principles of reserve management.
Mr. Leong.
Mr. Speaker, pardon me, I still like to ask the Minister of Finance. My understanding of how MES operate in the market seems to be different from his. When MES, the issue is not about OFR, you know. The issue is about when MES accumulate foreign reserves, accumulate foreign assets, or now we can call foreign reserves. What do they use to buy the reserves in the first place? Right? In the past, we have excess savings. So MES have a lot of government deposits on its balance sheet. So it can use the government deposit to buy the foreign reserves first. And then it transfer over the GIC and reduce both the assets and liabilities at the same time. But if you don't have enough government deposits on the balance sheet of MES, then when MES accumulate the foreign currencies or foreign reserves, what do MES use? I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance, what do they use to buy the foreign assets?
Mr. Speaker, I don't intend to engage in a very technical discourse here. I just repeat my point. In both instances, MES uses its excess foreign reserves, excess OFR. Like I said, in the first instance, it's done through a transfer of government deposits, a corresponding reduction in government deposits. But in the second instance, we are proposing for MES to use its excess OFR to subscribe to the RMGS. There is no creation of new money in this process.
Mr. Leong.
No, this is, Mr. Speaker, Minister, this is not the right understanding of the process, you know. I can invite other members in this House to comment on this. When MES buy foreign assets from the market, MES need to pay for it. If there's no government deposits to pay for it, MES will have to print more Singapore dollars to pay for it. So that will have a different effect on our economy. You can't say there's no departure from the current way of monetary policy operations.
Speaker, I'm happy to have other independent views because somehow Mr. Leong doesn't believe me. I don't know how I can convince him otherwise that he is indeed mistaken. But he would have heard Professor Hoon explaining the mechanism quite clearly. There is no creation of new money in this process. MASs is using its excess OFR to subscribe to RMGS. It's not printing new monies. It's very clear. I've said it repeatedly. The safeguards are in legislation. I don't know how else I can persuade Mr. Leong otherwise, and if he prefers for a third party to express views, so be it. I'm happy to have other voices share their opinions as well.
Would anyone else like to add some enlightenment to this discourse? If not, then the bill be now read a second time. As many as of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Ministerial Authority of Singapore Amendment Bill.
Committee stage, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill.
The question is that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill. As many as of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that clauses 1 to 8 stand part of the bill. As many as of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bill to be reported. Minister Lawrence Wong.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to report that the bill had been considered in committee and agreed to without amendment.
Third reading, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Monetary Authority of Singapore Amendment Bill.